Good morning, church, and welcome to the Midweek message. The past few weeks has felt like a constant whiplash of attention for me. That we make gains with the coronavirus and COVID-19, and start to think about, well, maybe normal life can return, and then there are resurgences like ones we're hearing about now in the news, and other find them in other places, and then we wonder, well, is that going to happen here? And how can we make sure it doesn't happen here? What does that mean for our choices? And then the next day, we remember that there's other pandemics, like the pandemic of racism, and it becomes visible, kind of like a mushroom that pops up out of the ground after the rain. But we know that the roots have been all around us all the time, and we're weary. We're weary of being alone, weary of carrying burdens of family and work without the supports that we've come to rely on and need. And the storms of life always reveal where our foundations are strong and where they are weak. Jesus concludes his great teaching that we call the Sermon on the Mount with these words about our foundations. He says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he or the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles?' And then I will tell them plainly, 'But I never knew you.'" Jesus goes on and says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came and the storms rose and the winds blew and it beat against the house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came, the storms rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." The first thing we see out of these words of Jesus is that we can't change the storm. Storms just come. They're part of life that God allows. God allows hardship, God allows suffering, God allows tears and loss and death. God allows evil even to have its day. Most of life is really out of our control. If anything, this time has shown us that. And this makes it even more important that we are faithful in what we do control, which is our response to what life gives us, to the storms, to the people, to the good days, the bad, to shaky foundations and trembling houses. How do we respond? And as Jesus says, how do we build our houses? How do we build our lives? Do we build them on rock or do we build them on sand? So we can build them on ground which looks firm and stable. Sand sometimes looks like a great place to build, but the storms of life, which always come, are going to show us whether that ground is sand or rock. And Jesus doesn't pull any punches when he says that just saying the right religious words, calling him Lord, Lord. He says that doesn't mean much if we don't live his words and his teachings. And maybe now this is a kind of an especially pointed thing for us when we can't be together in corporate worship, when that's not available to us. We can't even say those words, Lord, Lord, together. So maybe the question to ask is, well, where do you see stress lines in your life and in your faith? What have you encountered in solitude? The person that we're always with, even when we're alone, is ourselves. And maybe Jesus would ask us, well, do you know this person you've met? I mean, when he says to those people who called him Lord, Lord, he says, "I never knew you." Maybe that's the question of us: is do we know the person we've met in solitude? And if you could give advice or spiritual counsel to this person who might look a little like you, what would you tell them about how to build on a strong foundation? What would you say to them? What would you say to yourself now? Well, the foundation for a solid life is in living out Jesus' teaching, and in particular, those words in the Sermon on the Mount. They don't have much at all to do with saying religious words or doing spectacular things in public, even even going to church maybe. But how do we live out those words? That is where our foundation of our faith is built. That's the foundation on which we can build our lives. Are those words and our obedience to them. Remember that the storm doesn't wash out a firm foundation. So where in your life and faith is there strength? Where have you seen strength and faith? Is it something internal? Maybe you've discovered a new element of community within the church that you weren't aware of when we were meeting together. Can you name that piece of strength within you? Can you name that piece of your foundation? And how can you build off that foundation, that firm place, and strengthen the other parts of your foundation as well? So maybe taking time and reading the Sermon on the Mount, starting with the Beatitudes, reading through that chapter. It's Matthew chapter 7. That reading that can help you show where to be building off of. And maybe, who do you know who's struggling to keep their house upright? Who's struggling with a shaky foundation? And can you pray for them? Or do something to encourage them? We do need one another. We just don't have one another in the ways that we're used to right now. But maybe we have a strong foundation in other places. How can we build off of that to weather this storm? Because we can't just wish this storm away. In fact, maybe even God is allowing this storm to show us this is where you're weak, and this is where you need to build a stronger foundation. Maybe this is one of those hardships for us as people of faith, or for us as a church. And we need to learn from it. We need to learn from this storm. We need to learn from this pandemic. It has something to teach us because God is allowing it. And God wants us to learn from it. God wants us to grow. God wants us to build firmer foundations, to build upon the obedience that we have to His words. And so blessings on you as you do that work day in, day out, minute by minute with your friends or your spouse or your children. As you do that work, the work that Jesus has taught us in this sermon, the work that